Hello, Petra. I think you can start and open the webinar.
Hello and welcome to the webinar titled Towards Sustainable Food Consumption in Europe, the Role of Informal Food Chains. The seminar is organized by Petra Jehlička, and I'm a senior researcher at the Institute of Ethnology of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. The webinar is one of the follow-ups to this evidence review report that was published earlier this year. And so far, the main policy focus in the European Union has been on providing consumers with more information for them to be able to make healthy and sustainable food choices. And it's becoming increasingly clear, however, that it's not enough and that the strategy has a limited reach because people choose food not just through rational reflections, but also because of reactions and the financial and social situation. The European Union's food environment is more diverse than we tend to think and includes shops, restaurants, and workplaces, but also informal settings such as homegrown and donated food. And we think that the non-market-based food systems deserve more attention, and that's what we will try to do today. We are lucky to have an excellent, who is the president of the Czech Academy of Sciences and a member of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission. And she's also a professor of anatomy and physiology of plants. And the next speaker will be Francesca Galli, an associate professor at the Department of Agriculture, Food and Environment at the University of Pisa in Italy, where she teaches agri-food policies and agricultural economics. And her research interests include the functioning of the food systems in ensuring food and nutrition security, the assessment of sustainability performances of value chains, and the role of food policies. The next speaker is Lucie Sovova, who is an assistant professor at the Rural Sociology Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on alternative economic theory and practice, particularly in the field of food and agriculture. And the final speaker is Michaelis Grivinch, who is a professor at the Faculty of Communications of Riga Stradinch University and also a senior researcher at the Baltic Studies Center in Riga. And his key research areas are sustainable food systems and food practices and non-timber forest products and foraging. And my own research focuses on sustainable food consumption, informal food economies, and also the geopolitics of knowledge production. And I'm also a co-author of the SAPER evidence review report we are discussing today. Now, in terms of practicalities, to make the webinar a bit more interactive, there will be time for answering a couple of questions from the chat between each individual presentations, and there will also be a space for an open discussion at the end. And now I would like to invite Professor Zajimalova to give her presentation, and bear with me because I will need to upload her presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for introducing me, and good afternoon to everybody. This webinar is focused, as Professor Jehlička said, towards sustainable food consumption. And I would like to say a few words in the beginning about so-called scientific advice mechanism that is working to help European Commission to adopt reasonable policies based on scientific knowledge. So please, next slide, Peter. Thank you. The scientific advice mechanism has developed over time, so it is more than a decade, and there are three major pillars for the scientific advice mechanism. There is a secretariat in the European Commission, of course, that is support for the work of so-called group of chief scientific advisors. There are 7 people from the whole Europe with very different expertise. The president or the chair of the group is Nicole Grobert, that is the lady on the upper row of photographs on the left. She is expert on nanomaterials. Then Nebojsa Nakicenovic from Austria. Nicole is from Germany but working at Oxford University. Nebojsa Nakicenovic is from Austria and he is an expert on energy economics. Maria Krusma, she is from Estonia, expert on biorobotics, and myself. And the bottom row, it's Alberto Meloni from the left, who is historian from Italy, Eric Lamban, who is expert on geography and sustainable science from Belgium, and very recently adopted member who is Naomi Ellemer, who is from the Netherlands, and she is expert on psychology. And the last pillar is so-called SAPEA, which is abbreviation for Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, and it's a consortium. Next slide, please. And this is just the basic scheme, how SAM works, and basically SAM is an interface between science and policy. So in the green frame, there are organs of European Commission, commissioners, directorate, SAM unit, and of course DG Research and Innovation and DG Joint Research Center. And in orange frame and orange color, there are group of chief scientific advisors, SAPEA, and of course experts in the field and European scientific academies. And next slide, please. And based on this structure and the processes that are already established, SAM can provide independent synthesis of scientific evidence and policy advice on very complex issues. And there are few examples here, and always there are pairs, and these pairs are because SAPEA is providing so-called evidence research report, which is kind of summary of up-to-date scientific evidence on the topic, and then so-called scientific opinion that is based on that evidence research report, but it is actually prepared using the knowledge of, and let's say, the general view of scientific, of the members of the group of chief scientific advisors. They have very different expertise, as you heard. So it is not such a, let's say, in-depth view to the particular topic. However, it is, let's say, very reasonable scientific review on the topic. So there are a few examples from the recent time. And next slide, please. And as you can see, some scientific advice on sustainable food was already produced in the year 2017, and it was focused on the oceans, food from the oceans. On the left, there is a SAPEA evidence research report. On the right, it's a scientific opinion. And in 2020, there was another thing called a sustainable food system. And this is actually the basis for this year opinion. Next slide, please. And this was the previous one, please. Yes, in March 2020, as I already mentioned, a sustainable food system was produced, the opinion, and it led already in May 2020 to farm to fork strategy, which is actually quite a short time, and we can see that there is really some impact of some scientific advice on decisions or, let's say, suggestions provided by the European Commission. Next slide, please. And in 2023, another scientific opinion was provided towards sustainable food consumption. There was a scoping question that was defined by European Commission, and basically this was focused on the tools that could be used at the EU level, in addition to those that were already included in farm to fork strategy, to overcome the barriers preventing consumers to adopt sustainable and healthy diets. And what is new in this is the fact that actually European Commission and also a group of chief scientific advisors in SAPEA suggested that social scientists must be included in this, and that it is necessary to adopt a really systemic approach because the food environment, it is not just food production or food consumption, but it's very complex architecture of this. Next slide, please. Better, next slide. Yeah, thank you. So we produce this one. On the left side, it's sustainable food consumption produced by SAPA. This is evidence review report, and on the right side, it's the scientific opinion. And in this scientific opinion, there are some policy recommendations. Next slide, please. There is a general recommendation that stresses that it is necessary to coordinate the adoption of a coherent mix of complementary policies that are addressing different aspects of the thing. Next slide, please. And of course, how to do it. It's a very important question. And basically, we are saying that it is necessary to have some long-term vision on healthy and sustainable diets, that there must be a coherence between different interventions, there must be high-level policy coordination, but also responses to the new policies must be monitored. Next slide, please. And there were 3 specific recommendations. First one is to make healthy and sustainable diets the easy and affordable choice. Next slide, please. And there are some particular recommendations how to do it. Of course, it is necessary to introduce taxes on products whose frequent consumption is not healthy and not sustainable. On the other hand, in contrast to this, it is necessary to make healthy and sustainable diets more affordable. Of course, it is necessary to adjust subsidy schemes for some production systems that are of low environmental performance. And of course, it is necessary to invest to better education for all inhabitants in the EU. Next slide, please. Better, next, okay. Recommendation number 2. Of course, it is necessary to provide adequate and trusted information so that people actually are encouraged to adopt healthy and sustainable decision making, and this should be made by all actors in the food system. Next slide, please. And of course, this is very difficult to set some recommendations how to do it. Of course, there must be inclusion of sustainability criteria in national dietary guidelines. This will not be an easy task. It is necessary to define and communicate the EU-wide and national scale time-bound goals. It is necessary to develop information campaigns and, of course, awareness about health and sustainability impacts of diets, and, of course, education programs to improve what is called food literacy. And, of course, encourage consumers to establish more direct connections with primary food producers, because this is important not only economically, but also, let's say, from the point of view of general knowledge. Next slide, please. And of course, this is very complex, so it is continuation of recommendation number 2. And maybe it is interesting now in digital age that the potential of the digital food environment should be to inform consumers and should be really made use of more than it is done up to now. Of course, it is necessary to restrict advertisements for those food products that are not very healthy, of course, beverages as well. And of course, it is necessary to give an equal voice to all stakeholders. Next slide, please. And recommendation number 3. mandate new interventions to promote the availability and accessibility of products for healthy and sustainable diets. Next slide, please. And this is actually about encouraging member states to regulate the placement in retail outlets of those products that are not healthy and not sustainable. On the other hand, require food products reformulation so that the availability of healthy and sustainable food is increased, and restrict EU imports of food commodities from places where food production either causes major environmental damages or some other problems. And of course, there are various means like border taxes or bans, etc. Next slide, please. And before I will thank you for your attention, I would like to say that fortunately already the policymakers and decision makers in the EU realize that some command-driven approaches to alternatives of conventional food systems are basically derived from research that is based on Western European context. Such include like ethical consumerism, certifications, marketizations, etc., etc. And it is obvious that it is really a very urgent need to widen the scope of what is considered a sustainable food system. Unfortunately, there are, even in Europe, already existing and largely sustainable, both from environmental and social point of view, informal food practices that are actually a very good example of let's say, good practice. And I think this seminar is going to be about this. So thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Zajimalova for this introductory talk, highlighting the importance of the scientific advisory mechanism, and also highlighting the 3 key questions towards the end of the presentation, which are really valuable to what will follow. And I was greatly encouraged by the emphasis placed on the role of the social scientists in this task that was outlined in her presentation. And I also pick up on her mention of the concept of food literacy and how it can be enhanced by bringing more closer together food producers and consumers. And I think several subsequent presentations will have a lot to say about that. And I also think that at least one of the presentations will pick up on the concept of digitalization and digital food and so on. So there is a lot of food for thought in her presentation for the remainder of the seminar. And thank you again. And now I'd like to invite Francesca Galli from the University of Pisa in Italy to give her presentation, which will in many ways be a smooth transfer from Professor Zajimalova's introductory talk.
Thank you very much, Petre. I hope you can see and hear me and see also the presentation. I'm Francesca Galli and I work at University of Pisa, and I had the pleasure to collaborate to writing the report. So I will focus on the key object of our exercise, which was the food environment, trying to situate it within the broader food system, because the approach we had decided to take was starting from a broader perspective and then gradually zooming in to the food environment. So what is the food system? Many of you may be familiar with this visualization that is a representation of food systems by the high-level panel of experts in 2017. And it may look very complicated, full of arrows and colors, but basically inside these representations, there are 3 elements. First of all, the actors, the processes that interact within the food systems. On top in blue, you can see the drivers of that impact on the food systems. And at the bottom, you see the food system outcomes, which are mainly food and nutrition security in all their dimensions and other socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. So aiming for sustainable food systems means moving towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So in a very short synthesis, food system thinking implies understanding how these drivers of change impact, and these can be related to demand, supply, and trade, and understanding what are the dynamics and feedbacks, and mostly what are the vulnerabilities in order to be able to anticipate the crisis that can impact on our food systems. So in the following step, what we tried to do was to account for all the different ways that citizens, people access food. And we organized the discussion around two main blocks. The first one is how the formal food system works. And this means the food system which is regulated by market exchanges and contract agreements. And we are all very well aware how these value chains across the world have a tendency to concentration and globalization. So a question that we were asking ourselves is whether these kind of globalized food chains impact and how on dietary quality. And there is mixed evidence in this regard. So trade on one side increases the dietary quality and the diversity, and on the other side, it may encourage access to unhealthy foods and drinks, including ultra-processed foods. The globalization, the economic development has positive and negative impacts on lifestyles, and generally this leads to bad outcomes in terms of obesity, and which is due to the nutrition transition, as well as on the environment, depending on where the resources are taken and what happens in exporting countries as demand increases. On the other side, we wanted to account, as it was already mentioned, for the informal food systems. And by informal, we tried to encompass both the alternative food networks that have different shades across Europe. If we look at the Mediterranean area, we see lots of short food supply chains linked to territory, production processes, geographical indications. While in the Anglo-Saxon areas, the short chain concept relates more closely to the reconnecting producers and consumers. And again, the evidence on to what extent these short chains or alternative food networks are more sustainable is the evidence is mixed. What we know for sure is that many of these products tend to be more accessible for middle and high income consumers because their prices is often higher, not always though. And together with these alternative food networks, which rely on the market to some extent, we have non-market ways of producing and consuming food. First of all, through own production, and also by sharing and exchange and donations. This part of the food system remains under the radar, and this is part of the reason why we decided to focus on this today, because all these ways food is produced and exchanged represents a very important contribution to resilience of the food system as a whole. And we realized that particularly during the pandemic, on where crisis allowed to shed light on these exchanges. All these ways altogether lead to shaping our food environments. Food environment is a concept which refers to the context in which food is accessed and eaten. So it's the concrete manifestation of the food systems for all of us, individuals, communities, countries, etc. And it includes the retails, the stores, hospitality, home, food banks, and all sorts of ways in which we buy or produce or access our food. It's an interface. And this interface allows for an interaction between our personal characteristics and the external world. So this is a picture to summarize the dimensions that are external or individual of the food environment. So on the external side, we have the food that is available, the price, the placement, the out-of-home consumption, the neighborhood, so the urban setting where we go to buy our food, the food composition, the information that goes with our food, and the social environment, which is very, very important in influencing the way we make our choices. And in the individual characteristics, look at the accessibility, the affordability, the convenience, and the desirability. This food environment shapes our food consumption and dietary patterns. The digital food environment was mentioned. It's a new dimension that needs to be understood, and it's starting to be conceptualized as an expansion of the physical food environment. It goes in practice through the online grocery shopping, the home delivery, digital information that we find on social and media around food recipes, lots of different ways which do affect the way we consume food. Evidence is still really growing, starting to being built to understand whether the impact is positive or negative. There are two sides of the same coin, so this needs more research. The way we were looking at our report, or working on our topic, was asking also what is a healthy diet, and we are aware that the non-communicable diseases and obesity are still big problems. On the other side, we have dietary guidelines, and despite the diversities across Europe, we all tend to agree that a healthy diet is a plant-based, rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, pulses, and fish, with moderate amounts of low-fat dairy products and limited amounts of red and processed meat, which is something that we focused on a lot in our policy analysis, together with a low consumption of salt, added sugar, and high-fat animal products. Another question that we have to ask is, what is a sustainable diet? So what are the impacts on the environment in terms of biodiversity, eutrophication, water stress, and land degradation, etc.? So again, the animal-sourced food do play a key role in the impacts that the food system delivers in the environment. And limiting overconsumption of meat and dairy in settings where there is overconsumption is key. But another very wicked question that we have to ask ourselves is how to bring together the healthy and the sustainable. So the report in the second chapter makes an attempt to ask questions around organic, to what extent it contributes in terms of a lower use of synthetic pesticides, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, but which is insufficient per se, if not together with a reduced consumption of animal products and a reduced weight. So by itself, it's not a solution. Local food, again, is not a solution by itself, because the sustainability impact could be unclear, but it's very important in terms of food literacy, as Petra was mentioning earlier. And the food waste reduction is also another hot topic that we have to address, which is both anticipating food waste production and at the same time finding ways to redistribute and to maintain the function of food without going to other purposes, such as energy production, for instance. So the following step was to ask what are the barriers to change food consumptions, and this was the COMBI model around the capability, motivation, and opportunity was adopted to understand these barriers in different domains. So what is blocking the consumer? Because a key assumption is that consumers are not fully rational, and choices around food are not made in presence of full information and transparency. But a very important part of the story in explaining food behaviors is automatic processes and so on. So I will not lose or steal time from the other speakers, because the role of policies was already well presented in the previous speech. But what the colleagues in the group tried to do was to organize the available scientific evidence around the policy tools that can change the food environment, which is the key lever for changing capabilities, motivation, and opportunities of the consumer. So these are the 5 areas, starting from the fiscal and economic incentives, physical availability, food composition, information, and social environment. And moving towards the end, these are the key messages, policy messages that were drawn from our exercise. Yeah, and I think I can stop here, looking forward to your questions if there are any, and to the discussion. So thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Francesca, for this comprehensive presentation outlining, the complexity of the food environment and of its 8 individual components. And I would like to encourage members of the audience to ask questions in chat if there are any. And I think your presentation, Francesca, also was very useful in providing the background for what will follow next, in my, Michele's, and Lucia's presentation. And it was really important that you highlighted the importance of alternative and informal. And I really like your point about the informal food system providing some kind of security at times of crisis, when these informal food systems can be mobilized. So it's important that they are always present because they can be mobilized when they are needed. So many thanks for that. Are there any questions? I can't see any. So in this case, it's my turn, and I will give my brief talk on informal food system. Right, so good afternoon from Prague again. And the purpose of this brief contribution is to focus on informal food systems in some wider context. So we usually tend to think of the economy, including the food system, purely in the market sense as comprised of wage labor and capitalist enterprise. And importantly, this conceptualization permeates the thinking about policy making as well. We will helpful view, and in the last 20 years in the social sciences, there has been increased attention to informal economic practices and a range of labels, including diverse economies, the sharing economy, and the like. And what we want to do today is to invite you to think of the food system in a more creative way, and Francesca has already started doing that. That includes market, alternative market, and non-market transactions, as this diagram borrowed from the work by J.K. Gibson Graham shows. In their daily lives, to obtain food, many people in Europe and elsewhere in the world as well combine formal and informal food systems. And this is another emblematic representation of the complexity of the economy that includes formal and informal economic activities in the form of an iceberg. As you can see, it includes myriads of economic activities that we do not normally see. That's why they are. And they include self-provisioning, informal and non-monetized exchanges within families and between friends, gifts, barter, and informal lending. And it shows, figuratively speaking, that formal economy is only the tip of the iceberg. The fluidity and interconnectedness of the formal and informal economy is captured by the model of the relationship between informal and formal economy that was developed by Colin Williams and John Round. Starting clockwise from the top left quadrant, informal economy can be seen as a byproduct of formal economy. Informal work expands in contemporary capitalism and can be described as a race to the bottom according to this conceptualization. In the second quadrant, informal is complementary to formal economy, and this is a more positive relationship between the two. Both formal and informal economy grow and decline in tandem. And in the third quadrant, informal economy is an alternative to formal economy. Informal economic practices have positive connotations such as progress and modernity. While in the fourth quadrant, the residue, informal economy is a temporary residue from earlier mode of production and consumption, which will be replaced eventually with formal market-based economy. And this is, by the way, a position that's often applied to informal food economies in the European East. Now, let me now focus on the positive half of the diagram. That was the right-hand side of the diagram. That is the informal economy as complementary or alternative to the formal economy. And let's apply it to the food system in several countries my colleagues and I have studied in the past. Drawing on our previous research, we can present a couple of important figures. For example, 50% of the population of Croatia and 50% of Czechs and 54% of Poles grow food in their households. It's a socially diverse set of practices. People from all educational and occupational backgrounds grow food. For example, 58% of Poles with primary, the lowest educational attainment, and 55% of Poles with tertiary education, university degree holders in Poland grow food. These practices are evenly distributed across class and economic status, but in reality, in some countries, it's a more middle-class activity than working-class activity. And importantly, positive motivations like the desire to obtain fresh and healthy food dominate in motivations for being involved in these activities. And it's a remarkably generous activity, as many growers share their produce with other people. For example, in Czechia, about 60% of those who produce food in their household share it with other people. And in Poland, this figure stands at 40%. And really importantly, and again, going back to what Francesca was talking about in relation to organic food, nearly 1/2 of Polish and Czech food growers produce what I would call non-certified organic food because they don't use industrially produced pesticides and fertilizers. Now, by extension, it could be claimed that the food system that includes both formal, that is market-based, and informal, that is non-market-based practices and transactions, enhances its security and resilience. And here I thought it was useful to draw on some ideas developed by the Nobel Prize laureate in economics, Amartya Sen. He says that a household food insecurity is related to a breakdown in endowments and to the concept of entitlements. Now, let me explain. A person's endowment set is defined as a combination of all resources owned by a person, and in practice, endowments include tangible resources such as land, equipment, and animals, and intangible resources such as knowledge and skills, membership in a community, and labor. And a person's entitlement set constitutes all possible combinations of goods and services that a person can obtain by using the resources of their endowment set. The resources in an endowment set may be used to obtain food in 3 imaginable ways. First, in exchange, where people use their labor to earn money with outlets. Second, in transfer, where people may use their membership in a local community to obtain food in the form of a gift. And third, in production, when people using their land and skills can produce their own food in gardens, allotment plots, and similar sites. So the underlying idea is that the greater the diversity of entitlements available to a household, the more likely they are to avoid becoming vulnerable and to be food secure, and consequently resilient. So combine several entitlements to make themselves more resilient in terms of food provision. They don't rely just on one source of food, like a supermarket typically, but complement it with food produced and received as the form of a gift from others. I think my 7 minutes are up, and I'll leave it there. And I'm looking forward to your question. Thank you. I can see one question in chat. EU policies, let me read it out. EU policies might have difficulties to be relevant for informal food chains, which I agree with, but how can they not undermine them then? Or is there another governance level that would play an important role there? Feel they can contribute, but as I said, I would agree with that, but maybe not at the policy level, but in terms of advice and encouragements, there could be signals from the EU level encouraging member states to first encourage informal food systems by providing some opportunities for them. And one example there would be the Czech gardening law, which was passed about 2 years ago, which actually declared allotment gardening as a publicly beneficial activity, and which mandated local governments and several ministries to support this activity, this publicly beneficial activity. And what I liked about this law was that it highlighted the importance of allotment gardening for the development of ecological and food literacy. You know, it explicitly mentioned that this is an activity that develops certain skills and knowledges that are useful in many ways, not just for food production. So that was one example, and we can leave other examples of this for the concluding discussion. But I agree with the person who asked this question that it's also important not to undermine these informal food systems, which is often the case, unfortunately. So if there are no further questions, I would like to invite the next speaker, who is Lucie Sobova from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Welcome, Lucie.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just gonna set up my presentation. Here we go. So thank you for having me, and thank you for your introduction, Petra. I titled my talk Diverse Food Sharing Economies, and that's firstly because I will be, of course, situating food sharing as one of the practices located in this informal part of the economy in the framework that Petra just introduced. But secondly, also because I wanted to refer to the diversity of food sharing practices. And I will do this by mentioning 2 examples from my own research. The first one is an ongoing research project called Cultivate. Cultivate is a Horizon Europe innovation action, which brings together food sharing initiatives, municipalities, researchers, and diverse social innovation actors. And its goal is to support urban and peri-urban communities in navigating the food system transformation by implementing resilient and sustainable food sharing. So food sharing is really seen as a valuable practice in this project, as it contributes to food system resilience. It can help mend inequalities and reduce food waste in urban food systems. And I should say that food sharing in this project is understood rather broadly as growing, processing, and consuming food together, sharing food-related infrastructure and knowledge, and of course also sharing food and meals with others. So the case I have been working on within this project, together with my colleagues at Wageningen University and also together with the municipality of Utrecht and an artist collective, Cascoland, is a case of an edible neighborhood, a newly built neighborhood in the city of Utrecht, where most of the green in public areas is edible, either for animals or for humans. So the neighborhood features a food forest, and it features a number of edible plants, trees, and bushes in the public space. And this is a pilot project of the Utrecht municipality, which aims not only at fostering sustainable and healthy living environment, but it also seeks to use food as a vehicle to foster social cohesion in the neighborhood. So the idea is that people will interact with these edible plants in the public areas and also engage with food sharing and get to know their neighbors in that way. And as I said, the neighborhood is new, so most people are still settling in their houses. So together with Cascoland, we have devised a number of interventions to support the development of food sharing practices. And these have included serious games and different neighborhood events. We had a pop-up kitchen and a neighborhood dinner. And all of these events basically inventorized the needs and interests of the people in the neighborhood. And a concrete project that came out of this were the food sharing boxes that you're seeing on the picture here. So this is basically repurposed old furniture, which people can adopt and place it in front of their house and then use it to share food that they have surplus of or that they no longer want with their neighbors. So this is work in progress, and this has been a really interesting experience in terms of observing how this engagement and sense of ownership is developed in a new neighborhood. And the type of food sharing that we focus on here is what I called here the food sharing economy. So as you saw, food sharing here happens in public spaces, and it is facilitated by a number of actors, which I call food sharing initiatives. So in our case, this has been the municipality itself, the artist collective, but also, for instance, the local school that has been really active in food sharing activities. So citizens need to be engaged in food sharing activities. They're being introduced to these practices and encouraged to adapt them into their routines. The second modality or variation on food sharing is something that I have observed in my PhD research called Grow, Share, or Buy. And this was a qualitative study of food provisioning practices of urban gardeners in Brno, Czechia. So I worked with households that were involved in food self-provisioning, the practice that Petra was also discussing. And I monitored the sources they used to obtain fruits and vegetables, and also the usage of these foods. And this latter point on how fruits and vegetables were used also gave me insights in food sharing networks that people were involved in. So in my research, all of the gardening households were involved in sharing homegrown and homemade food. And on this figure, you can see that many of them both received food from others and also gave food away. Although obviously different households had different roles in these food sharing networks. Some were more on the receiving end, whereas others were really central nodes from which a lot of food was distributed to other people. But in general, households gave away more food than they received. So we can see here that food self-provisioning is indeed a very generous practice. And food sharing here is motivated by the desire to share homegrown food, which is seen as having high quality. It's also a way of fostering social relations and in many cases also distributing surplus harvest and therefore preventing food waste. And what I want to highlight here is not only the amount of food that is circulating through these informal networks. The data that you see here is from 4 months of data collection. But what I also want to emphasize is the extent of these networks and the number of food sharing partners. And I just want to give an example of respondent 7 or household number 7 that participated in my research. This was a household with a very vibrant network of food sharers, which I attempted to map here, but it was actually rather complex to map. So you see how many different food sharing partners this household had, and they entailed family members, including extended family, different friends and acquaintances. If I'm not mistaken, I even received some food myself during the research, as well as people from the neighborhood. And what was most striking to me about this case was that the respondent perceived this as perfectly normal and actually took all of these sharing networks for granted. And only throughout the involvement in my research, she actually discovered the extent of food sharing. So what we see here is a different variation on food sharing, which I titled informal food sharing, which happens mostly in private and semi-public spaces. And it actually doesn't require any external organization. It's organized rather informally, based on existing social relations, but also strengthening social relations. And it's really seen as something very routine that people often take for granted, but at the same time that is driven by their intrinsic motivations and agency. So I want to highlight here in concluding that both forms of food sharing, and in fact we should see these rather as different sides of the spectrum, have the potential to contribute to food system resilience, mend inequalities, strengthen community cohesion, and reduce food waste. And the targeted interventions that I mentioned in the first case can be really useful in situations where food sharing practices are evolving and developing. But at the same time, we need to recognize the already existing informal forms of food sharing and also see them as valuable part of resilient food systems. So that was my contribution. Thank you for your attention. I'm not sure if there are any questions.
Many thanks, Lucia, for this presentation, which kind of brought to the fore two different modalities of food sharing, one slightly more formal, the other one completely informal. I think both are really valuable, as you highlighted in your presentation. And I think you also gave a partial answer to one of the questions we have in the chat. Let me read it out. Panelists have mostly been talking about why informal food systems are more sustainable than formal ones, but presumably both can be improved. If so, we seem to have a reasonably good idea about the different ways to change consumers' behavior with regard to the formal food economy. But do we have a good understanding of how to influence consumers in the informal food economy? How can we get people to make more sustainable choices when they get their food in informal ways? And perhaps, you know, what did your first case study based in the Netherlands kind of may have been a way how to achieve this, when kind of this new settlement can be kind of brought and introduced to these initiatives, and kind of people can be, in quotation marks, educated and enticed to join these activities that should also be enjoyable, not only should also be enjoyable. But maybe you would have more to say on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think that in relation to this, it's interesting to think about the relations between practices and people's motivations. And I think that what we have seen in the first case that I have mentioned, and in similar cases elsewhere, is that the interest in sustainable lifestyles comes first, and it might then materialize into the development of different food provisioning practices, such as food sharing or more sustainable consumer behaviors in general. And I think what we have seen largely within the work with Czech gardeners that also Petra has done and other colleagues is that this chronology is almost reverse. People are firstly involved in food self-provisioning practices or in food sharing practices because they fit their values in terms of generosity and conviviality and ideas about good life in general. And the environmental consciousness or the development of environmentally friendly practices follows from there, as it were. So in many cases, people are not explicitly driven by sustainability efforts, but these can also be developed through their practices and building on their existing values.
Thanks, Lucia. I also wanted to highlight, and before we move on, there are a couple of questions waiting in the chat, but I also wanted to highlight a couple of points from your talk, because they directly relate to the main topic of this webinar. And you also, in your graphs towards the end, you showed a huge volume of food produced by these urban gardeners in Brno, in Czechia, and also, how this is then reflected in these levels of generosity, because I noticed, it was quite normal for people to donate between 20 and, in the extreme case, 180 kilograms of food to other people, which is phenomenal in many ways. And I think, again, the important thing is that this is a completely unreflected behavior, as you mentioned as well. And it's perfectly routinized. People often don't reflect it. They don't kind of realize how important it is in quantitative terms and in terms of generosity, which I think kind of hides some lessons which you often don't see, because what we want to achieve with regard to behavior towards food is these routinized behaviors that kind of unreflectedly realize the sustainability ideals and objectives and so on. And here we have that. So that's why I like to underline the importance of the already existing sustainable behaviors delivering these fantastic results. Now, thank you again. And let me now look at other questions. And I would like to invite other presenters as well to relate to them if they feel they can. There is one question from Cecilia Casonato, or Cecilia perhaps. How do you address food safety for the food sharing boxes? I can see it as also being a leverage for increasing food literacy on food safety, but how is food spoilage, contamination, or allergen information handled by people sharing the food? Food safety also through legislation is often used as a barrier to these kind of informal network, but it can still be an issue. Would anyone like to take the question?
Well, I can speak to this from the case of Utrecht, and of course this, food safety and risk management is of course a crucial issue in food sharing, which is indeed entangled with varying legal frameworks in different places. And I think that in our case, where this is really seen as a community-based activity, even though it's sort of facilitated by an external intervention. This issue of food safety and risk management indeed also relates very closely to some of the more general topics of agency and ownership that I already mentioned, because in the end, it will be up to the practitioners to navigate this collectively or to develop practices that will help them manage the flows of food through these food sharing boxes. So to me, this is an open question, but indeed a very important one.
Thank you, Lucia. And I have one more question before we move on to the next last presentation for Francesca about food banks. This is from Massimo Zekavat. I've been helping at the food bank in Groningen. We have to dispose a relatively large amount of donations because they've passed their sell-by dates, although much of the food is perfectly usable. This is a classic problem. So, Francesca.
Yeah, I did spend some time understanding how the food donation networks work and how the charitable organizations are engaged in this. I don't have an answer, a general answer. I can suggest to have a look at a law that was quite a front runner in Italy since 2016. And this law on donation and distribution of food and pharmaceutical products for purposes of social solidarity and food waste prevention contains a set of very simple rules that make life easier for charitable organizations, including this issue of sell-by dates. So the law addresses explicitly the difference between use by and best before dates, clarifying by law that food products may be donated even if their best before date has passed. And this allows to recover and donate quite a large amount of surplus. And in addition, it introduces the possibility to donate, for instance, confiscated food products, a reduction of the coefficient on waste tax if to encourage the donation of food. So a set of measures that allow to recover more food, including the one on sell-by dates. So I encourage, and I can share the link to have a look at this law and see how it works, and if it could be applicable in other countries as well. Thank you.
Put it in the chat channel,
yes.
Francesca. Thank you. Now, I see one more question. I will answer it very briefly because it's quite an attractive one for me, from John McAfresh. Do we have an idea on how much less food sharing household waste compared to a typical household? I would slightly tweak the question because I can answer it from a slightly different angle, but still a valid one, I believe. We know from some exploratory research that households that produce their own food produce significantly less food waste. We don't really know exactly why, partly because of composting, but there might be other reasons, and I suspect there are. And from January, I will be involved in a major research project that will look exactly that, and Lucia Sobova will be part of the team as well. So maybe in a year or 2 year time, we'll be able to tell more. But definitely, there's also some evidence in the literature that growing food in a household is good for the reduction of the volume of food waste. And now I think Michaelis has been patiently waiting. Thanks, Michaelis. And that is the last speaker today, Michaelis Grivinch from the Riga Stradins University and the Baltic Studies Center on Foraging.
Yeah, thank you, Petru. Good afternoon. Well, thank you for inviting me and having me here and allowing to speak about a topic that's been close to my heart for the last decade or so. I understand that we have been having this seminar for an hour or so, so it means that everybody is already a little bit tired, so I have to be extra entertaining to maintain your interest. I will try to give a joke here and there and just to keep you awake while I'm talking. So, as I said, foraging is one of the topics I'm very keen about, but I assume that maybe some of you don't know what it actually means. And well, in a nutshell, it's a practice where people just go into forest or any type of wilder area and try to collect either edible or non-edible stuff. And in this case, we are mainly talking about edible things. And if you are like me from Baltics, or if you are from Balkans, probably the first things that comes to your mind is foraging for mushrooms or mushroom picking or mushroom hunting, depending on which one you prefer. But actually, if you start to look at what exactly people are foraging, then this typically we are speaking about 3 groups of products, which are mushrooms, berries, and edible parts of plants. This is a little comment on the photo. This is from Latvia, orienteering and mushroom picking competition, where all of the contestants were assessed both on how many points in orienteering they're found and how many kilos of mushrooms are found. So why should we talk about foraging? And I think that the answer is fairly simple, and actually it's the same that has been given by the previous speakers when they were talking about the issues they were asked to present. Basically, we are terribly underestimating how widespread the practice is. As this map, and this research that has been conducted like 8 years ago, and it shows that, first of all, there are foraging communities all across Europe. But then it also shows that some of the areas in Europe are extremely exposed to the practice, and there are extremely large communities actually engaging in the practice. And also our research shows that even in the places where the practice is not so widespread, it is gaining popularity, and the groups that are engaging in this practice are growing. With that being said, I think that a caveat needs to be made, like, while there are many people engaged in foraging, and there's also data showing that something like 90% of European households say that annually, at least once they have consumed some products that are coming from the wild. Actually, once we start to look at the amount of products that people are consuming or the share of diets formed by wild products, probably these are not very impressive. It wouldn't change the diets if people would start just, well, if we would regard just these products. But these products are providing a sort of additional aspects or other services that we should really pay attention to, because they might be a gateway to a number of issues that we have been trying to tackle for decades now. Namely, there are evidence illustrating that wild products could be linked to some of the concepts related to environment, like ecosystem services, green infrastructure, agroecology, agroforestry. Like basically, wild products could be a gateway substantiating introduction of these practices. Then I think it's no surprise to anybody by now. There is abundance of research showing that exposure to nature increases social well-being and also can act as a glue that sort of facilitates integration and sort of can resolve a number of societal challenges contemporary society faces. And then also we see that there is already abundance of examples where wild products in this form or another has been used to advance rural development. So I think what it all shows, at least partly, is that so there has been this myth that people who are engaging in foraging and people who are engaged in this practice, they are mainly doing it because they don't have other option or because they sort of lack in possibilities to access food. But what our research shows that, and it's not conducted just in Latvia, but all across Europe, that quite often, or actually always, getting this food out of the wilderness and from the forest onto the plate actually costs more than it would be to buy it. So cost isn't the issue that people are sort of listing when they are talking why they are doing it. But then we see that there are a lot of aspects related to values, related to perceptions, related to general worldviews people have when we start to discuss these things, why people are doing them. And based on this finding, recently we conducted a study where we tried to classify different types of foragers, and we basically concluded with 4 major groups of foragers that can be identified across Europe. One being rooted foragers, something that is more prevalent in Baltics and in the Balkans and in Scandinavia. And basically, this is a group that is much more motivated by the process, that has obtained its knowledge through historical channels and has integrated this foraging process in their identities. We have lifestyle foragers, so this is a group that has recently discovered foraging and ties it to broader values related how reality should look like and what we should do when we are choosing particular products for our meals. Subsistence foragers, much more motivated by product and sort of trying to benefit as much from the surrounding environment and sort of diversify their meals. And commercial foragers, which is sort of self-explanatory, a group of people that are trying to actually get some commercial benefits or monetary benefits from these products. So this is where my presentation, very short presentation, ends. But what I wanted to say are 2 major factors. First of all, that if we are, so there is no clear statistics on how many people actually are foraging, and so there is a couple of studies, but these are just indicating that the share of population is large, but we cannot monitor on how many people are doing that and how much food they are bringing out of the forest. And without such an attempt to actually look into this, we are missing a substantial aspect of how people engage with food. But secondly, as I showed, this particular practice can be a gateway to resolving many other questions we are raising about how to change people's behavior or how to facilitate transition. And just by looking into it deeper and trying to understand this practice better, we could actually simplify our way to obtain the answers that we are thinking on how to facilitate transition. So with that being said, thank you. If you have any further questions, please raise your hand or write them in the chat in this case. Thanks.
Many thanks, Michaelis, for sharing with us these amazing photographs of Boletus mushrooms, very appetizing. And also, for kind of showing us this really invisible part of the informal food system, because foraging tends to be neglected even more than the other parts of it we were talking about before. And one more thing I want to highlight in your presentation is the multiplicity of reasons why people get involved in informal food systems. And I like your diagram towards the end, and I want to remind ourselves again about this is always a combination of several things. It's never one reason only. So tradition, lifestyle, as you mentioned, subsistence, but I always try to emphasize the importance of enjoyment, because these activities related to sustainability, resilience, and so on are often perceived as very enjoyable and a source of pleasure, rather than being limiting or associated with hardship and so on, the negative connotation. So many thanks again. And I can see that we have something like 17 minutes left for the discussion. And there was a wonderful question from Balint Balash. How do you see the role of various stakeholders, especially local municipalities, in opening up opportunities for informal and non-formal food provisioning? Lucia, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I can make a start, and then I think other people can also add.
Sure. This
is indeed a key question, and we also discussed it briefly when preparing for this webinar. And I think that the general consensus was that the point is not to formalize these informal practices, because that would also go against their ethos. But I think from my view, I can really see the importance of maintaining spaces for these activities to happen. And those can be physical spaces to begin with. In Czechia, we have seen that urban gardens are often threatened by development plans, which see other more profitable uses of urban land. And I think that this is happening everywhere. And in my view, this is really a misunderstanding of the value of the practice, which, similarly to what Michaelis was saying, can indeed tackle a number of very complex issues. And I think what we also see is that once these physical spaces disappear, quite often the skills related to these practices also kind of lose the collective memory and are then difficult to reclaim. So I think that municipalities can hold these spaces both in terms of physical spaces and in terms of, for instance, facilitating spaces for events, food festivities, etc., etc. And maybe another thing I wanted to add from a slightly different angle is that it's also important to understand kind of communal activities in a more broader sense, because what I have seen in my research with urban gardeners is that even food that is grown in private gardens is actually shared very widely. So even if these spaces might appear privatized and not serving public good, in fact, they are creating these very widespread, resilient networks around them.
Thanks a lot. Francesca, I figured you would like to add something to this.
I think Lucy gave a very clear and comprehensive reply. I was just thinking of how this happens in different settings, and I was just coming out of another interview doing for a research project where the role of the question was on the role of municipalities, local institutions, and an institutional way of doing the things that Lucy was mentioning here in Italy finds a place for experimentation in what we call communities for food and agrobiodiversity, which are defined by law. There is a law, and in this framework, in this governance arrangement that is formally set up, many informal activities can be encouraged. So through these networks of municipalities, processing companies, collective catering, farmers, local NGOs, associations such as Slow Food and others, these should encourage and do encourage in some places more than others, sharing activities, training, because all this informal food sharing and foraging requires knowledge, and sometimes this knowledge is lost. So in my area here, grandparents play a key role, and older people do have the knowledge, but sometimes it gets lost. So finding ways in which this knowledge can be brought to the surface and transmitted to new generations, it's very important, I think.
Thanks, Francesca. Just to add to this, I think it's really important not to think of the food system, the formal one and informal one, as separate domains. I think we have made a huge effort today not to think that way, not to kind of convey this message. And it's great that we are giving these examples showing how these two domains are interconnected, they can benefit from each other, and how people in their daily lives navigate both without really often reflecting on this. I think there is a question waiting for Michaelis. And,
Should I answer it?
Is there any evidence of potential harm to local ecosystems related to excessive foraging, for example, is the question.
The simple answer is yes, of course there is, and but sort of it has to be regarded case by case. And it's when I say case by case, I mean geographically and also depending on the varieties that are collected. And for example, we see that in Scandinavia there are huge amounts of different berries are extracted from forest, but there are no indications that would harm in any bad way the ecosystems. It's the same case in Latvia, where you see large quantities of berries extracted, but then just human presence has a bigger negative impact than the berries extracted. But then, of course, just by the fact that industrial supply chains are linked to wild products can lead to the fact that over exploitation of some particular areas are occurring, and this is a risk that should be observed, but that shouldn't be a reason to sort of to move away. And just a quick comment on top of that, quite often we see that actually once the conversations about the overexploitation of natural resources are a hidden discussion about how people feel about the ownership of these products. But it's not so much about overexploitation, but about that there are newcomer groups that are trying to also benefit from these groups, and then some arguments are raised that sort of try to exclude these new groups, and this just leads that wild products cannot be really, or wild conversation about these products cannot be had without discussing the ownership to the land, the ownership of the resource as such. But if I may add something to the previous discussion that we had, what is the role of municipality? I think Lucia summarized it nicely, saying like these are informal food practices, and sort of they should be kept informal, and then we should just create space and maybe infrastructure. But then I think that the key is that quite often these informal has testicles coming out to different commercial activities, and then the small scale or larger scale. And by supporting these just local activities, you can actually strengthen the informal activities. So you don't necessarily have to work within the informal. They will manifest themselves if you will create an environment for these small scale activities to flourish anyway. So, yeah.
Many thanks, Michaelis. I think there is one important question that might appeal to several of us. From Massive Zekavat again. My research concerns the use of humor, satire, and comedy in environmental communication for encouraging behavioral change at individual and collective levels. I'm curious whether we have come across, the panelists come across examples of that could be shared. I think that that's a really good question, which kind of relates partly to what I was trying to say earlier about enjoyment being an important element in this, and pleasure, rather than restrictions, limits, and hardship. But I can't provide an example of a kind of deliberate communication based on satire, humor, etc. Can anyone on the panel?
A couple of years ago, there was a play in ESRS Congress from Netherlands, and that was sort of about a pig farmer, I think, or Danish pig farmer. I don't know, maybe somebody who was there remembers it better, but I think that was if I remember it correctly, it was a huge success, and it was presented in the Congress because it has been traveling around and it been played in different settings, and sort of people felt very connected to the play and to the characters presented in the play. But it was in general about issues of farming and also this need to change.
I attended the same conference, and I also vividly remember that performance, which was the best bit of the conference. And somebody, I think it was from Flemish region of the Belgium, giving this kind of satire on the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, and its effect on the ground in Europe. It's a very unusual topic for satire, but it was good. There's one question.
I have an example if it would be useful on this satire, comedy, humor, but also how to deliver very strong messages coming from another research project focused on well-being or unwell-being of farmers, so the suffering of farmers in their situations in running the farm. And it was a video, it was a cartoon, it was a story of a farm, and it was so much more effective than all the data that we could. It was even too much. So we as researchers were a bit worried about sharing that cartoon with stakeholders and farmer associations, because it was really strong on the lack of well-being of some farmers and the situations they have to live. But for sure it has a very strong communicative potential, much more than our graphs or lots of words that we may use. Sometimes we fail to reach the aim.
Excellent, thanks, Francesca. One more question from John McAfresh. This is what we want to hear. These presentations have all been incredibly interesting. Would anyone be able to recommend research into whether how people that begin foraging, food sharing, improve a sense of life satisfaction, sense of community, etc.? If this kind of linking maybe psychology and materiality of these practices.
I might recommend keywords to start your search. I think something people don't usually come up with immediately, but what might be helpful is concept of nature prescriptions. And it's something relatively new, but basically it's the idea that you don't definitely necessarily prescribe drugs, but you might prescribe nature and the body who sort of introduced you to the nature, and that might serve the same purpose. And just by looking into this notion, you might find interesting articles on what you mentioned in your comment.
And there's definitely quite a significant body of academic literature connecting home gardening and sense of well-being and satisfaction in life and so on. I can't name anything from the top of my head right now, but it's really quite easy to find quite a decent body of literature on that. That is knowledge. I can see that we are slowly approaching the end of the session. We have 4 minutes left. I'm not sure whether there are any more questions. I think colleagues on the panel were sharing some information about foraging and regulation. That's in the chat. One new message. Okay. Are informal food chains also developing in a digital space? Does that redefine the way we commonly envisage informal food chains? That's a really important one.
I don't think we know enough about digital environments, food environments yet to say, but it is indeed a very interesting question. Although I wonder to what extent, I'm thinking of social networks where information is shared, access to different groups. For instance, I think of foraging can be encouraged by the social media. But yeah, it does for sure redefine, but we don't, at least I'm not aware of how. So no final answer on this, but a good question.
There are definitely a lot of apps, as you said, helping people to find places of free food, where they can go pick apples, for example, and other fruits from publicly accessible orchards and so on. That's quite common in Germany, in Czechia, and so on. But there are many more apps facilitating food sharing and so on. I think Michaelis has raised his hand. He wanted to add something.
Yeah, a very quick answer. I think, well, I agree with Francesca that we don't have definite answer, but there is evidence of how this might help to improve sharing and also foraging. In foraging, the example is very simple. We see number of people who feel much more secure to go into wild areas, into forest, because they have GPS systems, because they have sort of equipment that allows them to go further, and thus they can observe the nature more, and this creates connectedness, and this has a number of indirect effects. But then regarding sharing, I think one of the aspects that really people don't discuss so often is that, for example, what exactly people are sharing, and or in the terms that we see that in Latvia, for example, when there are people sharing, they are sharing a numbers of zucchinis, and not everybody knows what to do with so many zucchinis, but sort of because somebody has grown a really huge box of zucchinis, they are sharing it. And then what we have observed is that digital sort of sharing places allow just people who love to grow things to pass them on further on. So if you have a broader networks of whom can you deliver, because quite often it's not about people who, it is definitely about people whom you know, but not only. You want to sort of reach broader networks. And then it's not just in Latvia. I know that I have had a conversation with colleagues from Ilvo, which is a Belgian research entity, and they were saying that it's a common to receive emails saying like, look, we had an excessive potato harvest this year. Does anybody wants a box? And sort of, and that was enabled by this new possibility of accessing digital means.
Thanks very much, Michaelis. And I think we need to bring this session to an end. And I will do it by using Maria Alonso's question, which was, do you think it's important that informal food system, sustainable food transformation? If so, how could we do that? I think we have partly alluded to it in our different diverse contributions, but I'd like to wrap up, and if anyone feels like they want to conclude something, please feel free. I think to include these informal food systems, despite their widespread nature, despite their importance, despite their ability to be mobilized in times of crisis and providing resilience to the society and to food system, to be included in legislative efforts. But one thing I want to highlight is that we should make sure, and the EU level should help in that, is that these systems are not undermined, destroyed, and so on, which is often the case. You know, typically urban city authorities in many countries are converting allotment sites that are hugely popular, for which there are huge waiting lists in most countries in Europe. They're converting them into developments, you know, shopping malls, residential areas, and so on, that are more lucrative, of course. That's one thing. And I don't want to go into detail, but allotment sites in urban environment are hugely important, not only for food production, but for many other ecosystem services they provide. So the first thing is try to find ways of not undermining them. You know, this is something which already exists and delivers good results, and that should be maintained. So we should be thinking how to maintain it and develop it ideally. And second, perhaps the EU could adopt some indirect ways of supporting these initiatives, such as, you know, I think Professor Zajimelová mentioned this food literacy, you know, so kind of how we can think about developing food literacy, because that would have very positive effects of these informal food systems in the end. So maybe there are some opportunities how we can do that. And the other thing is kind of we should think creatively how to connect formal and informal, because they can be converted into something which has multiple and enhanced positive effect for the food system. And one thing which I always give on these occasions is a little shop in a small town in Moravia in Czechia, which sells normal garden equipment, you know, tools and soil and stuff like that, plants and so on. But at the same time, local gardeners can bring in their produce, their surplus produce. They cannot eat, preserve, or share themselves with other people. They just don't know what to do with it. They bring it to the shop, put a price tag on it and their own name. And about 500 people in the small town do that. And other local people can go and shop this stuff. They know from whom they are buying it. It usually costs a fraction of what the same product costs in a mainstream shop next door. And it's usually organic. And you know the provenance of it because there is a name of the producer. So, you know, the combination of formal and informal in one place. And I think this is a marvelous example. And there are no barriers to do that. And I think we discussed quite a lot about municipalities, what they can do for informal food systems. And this is a perfect example because it exists and flourishes, this shop, because the local authority, local government supports it and provides, for example, a building for them for free without any charge. They have to maintain it, but they don't pay any rent. So, you know, this is all possible. This is how local communities can help. And we should be looking for ideas how to encourage these initiatives. And on that note, I'd like to conclude this session. We are slightly over time, but only 4 minutes. And I'd like to thank everyone involved, Professor Zajimelová, Francesca Gali, Lucie Sova, and Michaelis Grivinch, and also the organizers, Celine and Toby, for the support, and the Czech Academy of Sciences for organizing this webinar, and also SAPEA for initiating it. Many thanks. And thanks to people who joined us today for participating and asking fantastic questions.
Thank you, Petr.
So bye and thank you very much.
Have a nice Christmas and Happy New Year.
Indeed. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.